Now's a good time to not share the dirty laundry, proverbially, or since we're in our homes, literally. So this is the Life and Text class on the Parshat of Vayikra, and we're going to be looking at a text by a guy by the name of the Aish Kodesh, or Rabbi Kalonymus Kalman Shapira of Piaseczna. We have mentioned him in past classes. Piaseczna is to some degree like a suburb of Warsaw. And the fascinating thing about Kalonymus Kalman Shapira for me is his texts are good. They're not any more mind-blowing or any less mind-blowing than any of the other Hasidic Rebbeim, except if you remember or know what his experience was, which was that he was a rabbi in the 1920s and 30s in Poland who was eventually interned in the Warsaw Ghetto. And his book that we are reading from, the Aish Kodesh, was composed entirely in the Warsaw Ghetto. All of the lectures that he's giving, all of the teachings that I'm bringing over to you, were apparently given at Suda Shlishit, the third meal, in the afternoon or in the evening of Shabbat. And as soon as they were completed, either he or his Hasidim wrote down the lecture onto notes that that were eventually put into a can and buried in the Warsaw Ghetto when it was becoming apparent that the Warsaw Ghetto would be liquidated. And so they're faithfully recorded, but they're done from memory. So the Piaseczna Rebbe is writing from a situation of great peril and great danger and great suffering. And as a result, his teachings often take that like weight on them. He is often asking questions about how human beings experience suffering and how they survive through difficult experiences. So that's a good place to start. I'm going to share my screen with you so you can see what the text is, in case you haven't otherwise downloaded it. Should be up there right now for you. And you could still be able, for those of you who are newish to Zoom, you should be able to still see the pictures of some of the folks on your screen in a small box, which you can manipulate and pull around. So the text from this week's Torah portion starts off, Vayikra el Moshe vaydaber Adonai elav me'ohel moed lemor. The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying. Pretty innocuous opening verse, but our commentators are going to do a lot with it. So our first commentator who's going to deal with this, we're going to need to know some background information in order to understand what the Aish Kodesh is going to be talking about. And the first is the first comment of Rashi. Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki of France lived in the 12th century and just barely into the 13th, and is our preeminent commentator on all matters of Torah. And Rashi said this, the Lord called unto Moses, Vayikra el Moshe. All oral communications between God and Moses, whether they are introduced by daber or amor or tzav, which are three very common phrases in the Torah for how Moses is addressed by God, were preceded by the word call, kara. This word kara expresses affection. It's the language of chiba, as the text says. It is the mode used by the ministering angels when addressing each other. And this is to Audrey's point. As it is said in Isaiah 6:3, and one called unto another and said, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. So, and then we're going to go down and you'll see the next line in the Hebrew says, VeKara Zeh El Zeh Amar, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzavaot, Melo Chol Haaretz Kevodo. Okay? So Rashi is making a move. He's drawing together two known pieces of text which are important and significant in the Jewish world. Text one is this verse from Leviticus, Vayikra, and text two is this text which is from Isaiah, but we also know it more familiarly from daily prayer. In daily prayer, in what's called the repetition of the Kedusha, the third blessing of the Amidah, we have a different formulation where the text will go and say that VeKara Zeh El Zeh ve'amar Kadosh Kadosh Kadosh. And we are emulating in this section on which is called Kedusha, the actions of the angels in heaven. So a really important idea that some people may know and some people may not is that there's an idea that the angels in heaven are mirroring above what human beings do below. That we, when we pray in the Amidah and we call one to another and say, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. And there's this tradition in Judaism that we rise up on our toes 3 times because we are emulating what the angels are doing. There's this very strange, both Kabbalistic and even Talmudic understanding that what goes on in heaven is a mirror image of what goes on earth. What goes on earth is a mirror image of what's going on in heaven. And what that means is that humans are trying to duplicate and replicate what the angels in heaven are doing, that they call to each other, one another, and say, God, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. And we, on some level, are also trying to emulate and replicate what the angels do. That's weird, okay? I'm just going to leave that out there. That is a very strange idea. And the question is going to be posed in a second. How exactly is that happening? What aspect of calling one to another is occurring? Audrey has a question. Go ahead, Audrey. Unmute yourself.
I do have a question. This is a question that I've approached with Rabbi Adelson as well. Whenever we read this, I've always pictured the angels calling one to another, which is the English idiom, as being more 3-dimensional. And when we emulate them, we go Zeh El Zeh. We do like they have 2 sides, but they exist in probably more than 3 dimensions. And I always think that if we just do the side-to-side thing that we do, that's not enough. And I pictured it, and I always want to paint a painting of angels being in 3 dimensions, calling to each other simultaneously, not just one to the other as we emulate it. And that's my comment on this. It's not really expounding on it any, except that I think when we translate it, we limit it even in the movement that we do.
I think it's beautiful. I'll just add a thing from my father-in-law, who's a math professor. I said, what do you do? Like, he does something called applied math. And I said, what are you like measuring, like how big the wingspan of an airplane is and stuff like that? And he was like, no, it's more complicated than that. And I said, can you explain it to me? He said, sure. Well, right now I'm working on a problem where we're dealing with the question of a vase that's in 2 dimensions. It's like a painting of a vase, but it's really in 3 dimensions because the painting is like a tapestry and it can be flexed and moved. So I'm trying to calculate where all the vertices on the side of the vase move in physical space when you flex the 2-dimensional object into 3 dimensions. I said, oh, I understand that. And he goes, yeah, but actually the vase is in 6 dimensions. I said, what's a 6-dimensional vase? And he says, exactly. So I say this by way of explaining that I think it's a really instructive lesson into understanding how angels might work. Audrey's throwing out like, well, maybe it's more 3-dimensional. And I'm saying, potentially the angels are actually existing in the 6th dimension, which is not fathomable to humankind. My father-in-law can understand it on a mathematical level, but he can't understand what that actually looks like, which is a fascinating side question in and of itself. So automatically we're into the realm of really, it's a great answer Kabbalistically, and Audrey, you got us onto a great topic, which is Kabbalistically the question of a different question of epistemology. What can we know and what can we understand and what is actually beyond our knowing and understanding? So, Kabbalah is often the attempt to know that which is barely knowable. And this is a very good example of this, which is we are really trying hard to understand how the angels are practicing in the real world. The PSF is going to bring it down to real life in a very interesting way. Any other questions before we move forward? I may not be able to see your hand, so I'm scrolling. Great. The next piece of text you need to know in order to look at this, hopefully you can see it on your screen, is the daily prayer. And in the back end of daily prayer, there's this weird thing that we do called Kedusha de Sidra, which starts with Uva Letzion, And honestly, I'm not making this up. In 5 years of rabbinical school, I never talked about this prayer once. I never even thought about this prayer once. It was usually the thing that I was doing at the back end of services when I was kind of groggy and tired and not very interested anymore. I have a short attention span, to be honest. So I looked it up, and we're going to look at this in a second. But here's the text of Kedusha de Sidra. Kedusha de Sidra is Hebrew with Aramaic, and it's a repetition and or translation or commentary on the VeKara Zeh El Zeh Ve'amar. So it says this in the Hebrew: VeKara Zeh El Zeh Ve'amar, Kadosh, 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 and Tzavot Melkaretz Kevodo, Kablin Din Midin. So that I put in bold because it's going to come up again. Va'amrim, and this is all Aramaic. Kadish Bishmei Maroma, Ila Beit Shchinte, Kadish Al Ara Ovde Gevurte, Kadish La'olam La'olmei Olmaya. And the angels called to one another, saying, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is filled with God's glory. And this is a translation here into Aramaic of VeKara Zeh El Zeh Ve'amar. And they receive sanction from one another. That's Sim Shalom's translation of V'kablin din midin. The literal translation of V'kablin din midin would be, and they receive the law one to another. What that means, I don't know. And then they say, holy in the high heavens, filling the house of the divine presence, holy on the earth, manifesting God's power, holy forever and always. So that's maybe a translation, but probably more of a commentary, since Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh isn't really explicated as such in the Hebrew. It's only the Aramaic translation that adds what the three holies are. So it's not really a translation, it's more a weird commentary. So the first question that you might ask before we go forward is, what is this prayer doing here? So there are multiple theories in the prayer world amongst modern scholars as to what this, and really based on medieval commentaries, as to what this prayer is doing here. There are two dominant theories about why Kedusha de Sidra even exists. Dominant theory number one. So we say Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh again at the back end of services, and the reason is, what happens if you rolled into services late and you didn't get your Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh in the repetition of the Amidah? You can get it again, right? Which is a fairly logical answer. The second answer, which is an interesting one, is if you were not in services at the very beginning of services and you did not fulfill the obligation of early morning Torah study, here we are. You get to study a little bit here, right? Since we are quoting from Isaiah, you get to study a little bit of text and you get an Aramaic translation, which is really study of it. So either you're fulfilling the mitzvah of doing Kadosh, 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 even if you came late, or you're fulfilling the mitzvah of Torah study, even if you came late. Those are the two main theories of why Kedusha de Sidra exists. So we get this nice piece from Rabbi Danny Landis, who's the rabbi of Pardes in Israel. And he's going to add a little bit more to it, which I think is going to be really important potentially for understanding where our guy, the Aish Kodesh, Rabbi Shapira, the Piasetzner Rabbi, is going to go. And he says this: according to the Maharsha, a 17th century rabbi, the particular desirability of the Kedusha de Sidra is the fact that the key passages are translated into Aramaic, the lingua franca of the time. Because they are in a language that everyone could understand, both scholars and simple people could unite in praising God and studying Torah. Writing from the land of Israel in the 16th century, Yosef Karo, who writes the commentary Beit Yosef, but eventually becomes the guy who composes the main legal codex of Jewish tradition, which is called the Shulchan Aruch, explains why they were translated in the first place. The translation, he says, was mishum chiba, out of love, which we saw above. Rashi says the same thing, although Rashi says it about 200, 300 years before the Beit Yosef does. It's mishum chiba. It says it out of love. The love of the masses for words of Torah prompted their translation into a language that could be understood by all. The Mishnah in which Rabbi Joshua laments the terrible state of affairs since the destruction of the temple assumes that as long as the temple still stood, the world existed because of it. The temple was itself a sanctification of God's name. But it was also the center of Torah study. The Talmud in Baruchot 8a concludes that since the temple was destroyed, God's only place in this world is the 4 cubits of halakha. That is, lacking a temple, God reveals God's self to us throughout the study of Torah. The Kedusha today thus fulfills the world-sustaining function of the temple in 2 ways. It sanctifies God's name and provides verses of Torah study. So we have this whole idea of the Kedusha de Sidra, the Kedusha, and Vayikra, and the word Vayikra. So we're going to be drawing all these strands together by our rabbi, the Aish Kodesh. So here's the Aish Kodesh's commentary. So he's going to start with a question. The whole first paragraph is a question before you get worried this is going to be difficult. By the way, his language is a little hinky. It's not perfect, and my translation of his language may also not be perfect. So, but my translation is an attempt to explain it while also trying to be true to the words. So, Vayikra el Moshe, and the Lord called to Moses. And Rashi's explanation is that every utterance which is preceded by the word kara is an expression of affection, as we saw above in Karo and we saw above in Rashi. It is the language that the attending angels use, as it is said, and each one called one to another. And one could ask, why does Rashi use this verse, VeKara, Vayikra el Moshe, and each one called to another, to explain, and not the verse from the story of the burning bush? As it is said, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. So, and then there's another one. And so too Rashi could have used the receiving of Torah. And the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, thus shall you say to the house of Jacob. So the PSS Rabbi's first question is, what's so special about VeKara Zeh El Zeh ve'amar? There's lots of VeKaras in Torah, and he brings 2 others as good examples. The first one is one where Moses meets God face to face, and that one is at the burning bush. The next one is another meeting of Moses face to face, and that one is, and God called to Moses from the mountain, saying, thus shall you say to the house of Jacob. And this is the place where we get the 10 commandments. So there's this very fascinating moment where the Piasetzner Rebbe is going to call out Rashi's choice of which verse is useful here. And he's going to specifically call our attention to why it's VeKara Zeh El Zeh. Why is it, and the angels called one to another? Why use that verse and not another one? He's going to use this as a pivot to make a point, and you'll see this point come forth. Joe has his hand up. Joe, go ahead and ask a question or give me your 2 cents. Can't hear you, Joe.
Muted.
There you go.
Okay, so I got a little problem here because my understanding is that God wrote Torah first, and then he created the heavens and the earth, and as only after that did mankind build the temple. So the terrible state of affairs after the temple got destroyed and its impact on Kadosh, 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 I don't really think any of that is necessary.
Yeah, it's a good point, and I think it's really more of a riff off of Rabbi Landis's problem than my problem, which I agree with. So going back to what Joe brought out, he's basically bringing up this section here where it says, the Mishnah laments the terrible state of affairs since the destruction of the temple, and the idea that God exists in the 4 cubits of halakha. That's an idea that, like, we're bringing in Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh is a remedy to the destruction of the temple. There's a whole rabbinic idea that human prayer is the best we can do as a sacrifice now that we don't have a temple. You don't have to like that idea, and I don't necessarily think it's actually going to be key to the Piasetzner Rebbe's position here, but I think it's a legitimate point. Joe, did you have more that you wanted to say? Still muted, Joe. You're back.
Thank you.
Good. Okay, great. So we've got our question, and our question is, why this verse for Vayikra? It's actually really a simple question, which is, why this verse and not that verse? It's a very Talmudic question. Any verse that he wants to make a move with, why this verse? So this is our big payoff. This is where the Piasetzna is going to make a nice move, a really pretty move. I think it's a pretty move, anyways. He says, "Efshar ki VeKara Zeh El Zeh mitargamin v'mekablin din midin." It is possible that, and they called one to another, can be translated as, and they receive sanction from one another. So he's going to make the move here to say, VeKara Zeh El Zeh shows up again in Kedusha to Sidra, but it's translated into Aramaic in a different way. With this word, the word mekablin is this weird word, right? VeKara means, and they called one to another. Mekablin is the Aramaic translation, but mekablin doesn't mean called, it means received. And din midin has nothing to do with Zeh El Zeh. Din midin is they receive sanction one from another, or they receive law, or guidance, or justice one to another. The translation's funky. And so here, the PSX is making another move. He's saying, what's going on with this weird translation? It doesn't make, it's not literal, and maybe it's problematic. And then he keeps going. As in the prayer Uva Letzion, which if you are scoring at home is on page 156 of the big bluish gray Sim Shalom. You can also find it in the blue Shabbat one too. So then he continues. And the Turei Zahav said, the Turei Zahav was a 17th century commentator on the Shulchan Aruch, that the Amidah has 19 blessings so that, and this is really important, Israel causes the angels to receive sanction from one another. So this is that point that I made at the very beginning, that the Amidah is set up in such a way that we say prayers, and when we say VeKara Zeh El Zeh Ve'amar, when we say those prayers during Kedusha and we bow, it is causative. It is this Kabbalistic move where the people on earth do a thing and the angels get to mirror it in heaven, right? Sometimes it looks like we are trying to emulate the angels, but the way the Taz, the Turei Zahav, is explaining it is actually we're causing the angels to be able to praise God. If Israel does not say the prayer of Kedusha on earth and call one to another, then the angels are incapable of doing it up in heaven. The angels are weaker than humans. They're incapable of praising God if we do not praise God. And so what we do, this is this weird interpretation, but it's this metaphysical Kabbalistic understanding of how this actually works. When we do Kara Zeh El Zeh Ve'amar, the angels mirror it in heaven, and they reflect our spiritual energy from earth to heaven to God, and then God gets the radiance of the spiritual energy, and it causes the cosmos to spin in whichever way the cosmos spins. Really strange, but that's the way the Turei Zahav, who was living in the 16th century, understands it. But I think that the important thing as we move on is this concept that it's causative, that Israel causes the angels to do a thing, that we on earth do action, and it creates something bigger in the cosmos. It's a really interesting metaphysic point. This is neat on a Kabbalistic metaphysical way, but for me, that's kind of spiritually unfulfilling at the end of the day, because the idea that I wake up every morning and I pray, and the angels would then receive my prayers and then they would praise God, I don't need it personally. It doesn't do anything for me. It's what the Piasetzna does with this next that's the cool, mind-blowing piece, which gets back to our original topic of what it's like to be in quarantine and trying to find ways of being loving and human that affects the universe, that feels bigger than the four walls that we're stuck between in our houses. So he keeps going. This calling one to another, or another translation, receiving sanction one to another, takes place in Torah as well as in money. He says, b'mamon. He says you can do it, basically he's saying you can do it in two ways. You can do it by praying and by affecting metaphysically the universe in the, up above that we don't understand. But you can do it in real life too with your actions and with your pocketbook. Back to Joe's question from before about how much should I tip, right? And it is not just in giving tzedakah and in doing acts of loving kindness that one is receiving mekablin din midin, one to another, right? So too is the act of a person hearing their fellow's sorrows and then doing whatever they are able to do for their good. So here we've made a major move in just in 2 sentences. The PSS Rebbe has just jumped from saying you are making a metaphysic impact on the divine and the angels when you do Kedusha in morning prayer or afternoon prayer or evening prayer. No, not evening prayer. There's no repetition. Sorry. And he makes this move that we do something. We affect something above. We create movement between the angels when we give tzedakah, because we are literally doing mekablin din midin. We are literally causing our human beings are receiving one to another, and therefore the angels receive one to another, right? When I do tzedakah on earth, some aspect of tzedakah occurs in the above. Some divine wheel is spun, and the angels give tzedakah one to another. How that works, why that works, don't know. Then he keeps going, and he adds in the Hebrew here, it says v'gamach, which is the acronym for Gimilud Chasadim. So doing acts of loving kindness, visiting someone in the hospital, or sending a letter to someone in a hospital while we're on quarantine, or volunteering to give blood. I hear that the JCC here in Pittsburgh is taking blood donors, that there's now this massive spinning down of blood drives, and there's a need for blood. And it may increase as we go forward into this medical crisis, right? Every act of Gimilud Chasadim that a human being does is an act of receiving one to another in this idea of the PSS. And then he keeps going. He adds to it, so too is the act of a person hearing their fellow's sorrows and then doing whatever they are able to do for their good, right? Going on a Zoom call and hearing people kvetch is a divine act which stirs the angels and God's self. That's what the PSS and the Rebbe says. By the way, I want to go back all the way again to who the PSS and the Rebbe was, right? He is writing this in 1940 in the Warsaw Ghetto. He knows that you can't always give blood. You can't maybe leave your house. He couldn't leave his house for fear of maybe being beaten to death in the streets. But just being able to sit with another Jew who lives across the hall from you, or going out into the street and hearing someone's kvetch, is a divine act, right? Just listening to someone who is suffering, just having a Zoom call and hearing someone say, like, I'm really worried about the coronavirus, is a divine act which stirs the angels to call one to another. And then doing whatever you can to help them, right? If your neighbor next door, this is a thing that many of us are experiencing. If your neighbor next door cannot get to the supermarket because they're immunocompromised and they're worried that they need milk and eggs and they don't want to go to the supermarket to get it, buying milk and eggs for your neighbor is a divine act. It is VeKara Zeh El Zeh. It is mekablin din midin, according to the PSS Rebbe, who understood better than any of us what it was like to be in a terrifying situation of life and death, because every day in the Warsaw Ghetto was life and death for him. Any questions up till here? He's going to go deeper, and his language is going to get visceral in a very interesting way. I don't see any hands, so we'll keep going. He's only got like 2 more paragraphs to go. Hopefully everyone can see this. Gwen, did you have your hand up? You do not. Okay, great.
No, I did.
Who's that? Who's I?
Marilyn.
Okay, Marilyn, go ahead.
I'm just, it is, what is fascinating to me which is not so much directed at the specificity of what he's saying, but at the universality of what he is saying. As you know, one of my areas of expertise is fantasy and science fiction, and I write very often about urban fantasies. And the key to urban fantasies, of course, is that they are based on the various mythologies. They go all over the place, you know, not just the Greek gods, but the Norse gods, Babylonia, you know, all over the place. And consistently in these fantasies, you see, and think of Neil Gaiman's American Gods, you see the concept that gods fade and die when people lose faith. And so what's being expressed here is not so much just an insular concept out of what he's seeing, but a very common perception that you see over and over again through a significant number of mythologies, and it evolves from those mythologies, not from the authors, but from the context of the research of the various mythologies that they're using as the base of their books. So there is some universality, not just the specificity of being a Jewish text, but a universality of the concept that our faith strengthens God, and in this case, the angels.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I love the combining of those two ideas, that God dies if we don't praise God's name, or God dies if we don't think of God, or God dies if we don't do godly acts, combined with the kind of spiritual force energy that's created by people doing good acts. But I also love, I think the thing that blew me away about this text, where I was like, I have to show this to my class, was the concept that typically Jews are a people of action, and we typically talk about doing mitzvahs. You know, giving tzedakah and doing gimilut chasadim are great acts of kindness. Are great examples of doing mitzvahs. But the Piasetzna is living in a world where you can't do that, right? And we're living in a world where we can't do that. We may be able to give online, but we can't physically give money right now because we can't leave our houses. And so too, many of us may be in a situation of financial peril where tzedakah is scary right now for us. We're not ready to give tzedakah until we know whether we have a job next week or the week after, right? So the ability for the Piasetzna to extend this out to just hearing people fetch as a divine act really moved me. Just the idea of the act of a person hearing their fellow sorrows. He says it in Hebrew, Rak gam keshe shomea et mitzurot Yisrael v'oseh kol ma sheyechol la'asot letovotam, right? You just hear a person's tsuris, and you do what you can for them, right? Sometimes just hearing people's tsuris is a divine act. It's beautiful.
And I would question if, particularly for the Judeo-Christian traditions, if this doesn't arise from the concept that we are created in God's image, if indeed we take that to mean that because everything is a creation, that we literally are part of God. And so when we let that part of us go, we're also letting God go, disappear and vanish, if it doesn't come from that concept of seeing ourselves so integrally connected, as it were, to the concept of Hashem.
Nice. Let's go 2 more paragraphs, and to kind of close this guy off. So he goes a little deeper, and it's an interesting language, and it's not entirely clear what to make of this. So there's a lot of room for you guys to help me understanding maybe why he added this, because I kind of think he hit the home run already. So he goes and says this: similarly, one whose heart is broken from their midst, the kirbam, in their nearness would be another translation, and their blood has gone out from their veins. One who has a broken heart can do tshuva for God, and also one who then prays to God on behalf of Israel. The one who receives and hears this person is also mekablin din midin, is receiving one to another, by receiving their broken heart and their request for forgiveness. So he does an interesting additional move here. And his additional move seems to be, and it's a move that exists in Talmud, that there's a spiritual elevation to being capable of hearing somebody else's suffering or accepting someone else's apology when you are truly broken, right? There's a concept, there's a line in the Gemara that says, all the gates to heaven are closed except for the gate of the brokenhearted. I think about that a lot. I think about that line a lot. All the gates to heaven are closed except the gates of the brokenhearted. And I think the PSSM is spinning off of that. And he's saying, person who is completely broken, right? Who is emotionally shattered, who, he says it as, I think metaphorically, their blood has gone out from their veins. And they repent, or they hear another person suffering and receive from another person. There's a whole nother spiritual level, right? So the person who says, I am terrified of the coronavirus, I am deeply scared, or maybe even worse, for those who I've read online, especially on Twitter, who say to themselves, I have the coronavirus, I don't know what's going to happen to me, I'm very afraid, here is what I am saying to you. That person who then becomes a crucible for being apologetic to others or accepting other people's apologies, who prays on behalf of the rest of the world while having a potentially fatal illness, is on another spiritual level, has moved heaven and earth and is kind of moving those angels in a whole nother way. That like one who prays from a deep place of brokenness can achieve acts of spiritual elevation that a regular person cannot. So maybe it's a person who's sick, but maybe it's just us. Maybe we're terrified. Maybe we're anxious. Maybe we're scared. And when we reach out to another person and talk to them about our anxieties, or we hear, better yet, their anxieties, we are doing a great act of Gimilut Chasadim, which is of great spiritual value. And I think for the P.S. Etzner to talk about this from his context of living in the Warsaw Ghetto and knowing that a lot of people probably were spiritually broken and trying to push them to say, I need you to move past your own brokenness and be support for somebody else, because we can't do this by ourselves. There's another spin here that he's moving very subtly. He doesn't say it explicitly, but I think it's obviously there, which is the VeKara Zeh El Zeh, the Kablin Din Midin. He's making a communal move here, which is to say, the angels call one to another, and we call one to another also, right? We are supporting each other in this time of peril and danger and fear. And no matter how low you've been brought, no matter how scared you are, Mekablin Din Midin, like receive one to another. You can't do this by yourself. The angels move God by moving one another. We support one another in order to move God. You can't do it by yourself, and you can't do it. You can't do it if you're afraid. And being afraid is not an excuse for not doing it for somebody else, right? Yes, I'm terrified to go to Giant Eagle and buy eggs. But damn it, if I need to get eggs, then I'll go to my neighbor first and say, hey, I'm getting eggs. Can I get you some, right? I may not want to do it. I may be afraid of doing it, but I'm going to do it anyways because it's the spiritual thing to do. We'll close it off with the last piece, and then we'll open it up again. He closes out by kind of finishing off the whole idea. Vehem mimenu rachmanut upolut tovot she'oseh lahem v'gam tefila she'mitpalalim be'adam ugoram bezem lemala mekablin din mi din. And for them to get from us, them being whoever we're talking to, sympathy, and for us to do good acts for them, and also for us to pray on their behalf. This causes the angels in the world above to call out one to another. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, right? How do we create this moment where the angels do this thing up in heaven? They create this, and this goes to Joe's point of like, replacing the temple with prayer. In the PSS's understanding, we are moving the wheels in heaven by doing the good acts and by receiving and giving sympathy, rachmanut, to another human being, and po'olot tovot, good acts. And then even if we can't do that, even if we are, for those of us who cannot in any way interact with the outside world, you can't even go to your neighbor and say, hey, I'm buying eggs, what do you want, right? For that person, there's prayer, there's tefillah. And I'm a rationalist. I have a hard time understanding how prayer works, but I also am an ecstatic Kabbalist on some level who accepts that I can't fully understand the ways in which the universe works and can say to myself, I pray and I don't know what it does. I don't know if it moves me. I don't know if it moves God. I don't know if it moves the angels. I don't know if it changes the energy in the universe and makes good come down upon me in a Kabbalistic way. But hopefully something, even if I can't do any other act for someone, I can pray on their behalf. I can oseh v'gam tefillah mitpalalim ba'adam, on their behalf. And up above, the angels will call to one another. So I can do something that will move the unmoved mover. I can move something that changes the energies in the universe. Joe raised his hand. Go ahead, Joe Jolson.
This is the most esoteric study session we've had, in my view. The theological constructs are confusing, to say the least. We have a pyramid, a trilogy here, with humans at the bottom of the pyramid, the angels in the middle, and God up front. God is no longer all-powerful. After all, if we stop doing Kadosh, 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 God dies. Certainly this idea of doing tzedakah is fundamental to the Jewish upbringing, the Jewish education that I had, as ever limited it was. But the theological underpinnings for it are so weak. I'm looking for a better word. They're contradictory.
Yeah.
Is God all-powerful, or is God dependent on us? These are important theological concepts. And I guess I probably knew all this stuff in the past, but I never kind of put it together. It's like, my God, the theological underpinnings for tzedakah should be stronger than this.
And I think I love that question. I love that it's a challenge to this text. I think it's partially a fairly, and you can understand it this way. This is totally legit. It's based on a narrow understanding of the relationship between humans, angels, and God, because you laid it out kind of hierarchically. And I think that we're not sure exactly what the PSS's concept of the relationship between angels and God is. There are not a lot of clear theological conceptions about the relationship of the three. One base understanding is clearly God is above the angels. One base understanding of the role of angels in the theophany, the divine panoply of God, is that angels and God and man are all locked in this kind of symbiotic relationship that is non-hierarchical, and that God does action in our world through the angels, that like God moves, the wind and the rain through angelic action, that angels are kind of some sort of intercessor between the above plane and the below plane. That's one conception. There are other ways of looking at it, which is that essentially that the angels are just aspects of God, and there's also concepts that humans are aspects of the angels, or that God, humans, and angels are all basically interlocked and they're inseparable one from another, that it's a lot more blurry than we raise it. Go ahead, Joe, and then Marilyn.
I personally, I like a very simple Lubavitch philosophy. that there's a little bit of God in each of us. And if we all do good all the time, then Mashiach has come.
Thanks, Joe. Go ahead, Marilyn, and then Joe Charney after that.
And I just wanted to say specifically to Joe that there's a very wonderful letter that Einstein wrote about why scientists should study the humanities. And he said, if you don't, you because you're so focused on the rational aspects of the things that the tools we use to try to understand the universe, sometimes you lose your sense of wonder. And that sense of wonder, Einstein said, is tremendously important because it's what drives us to go beyond that which we know into an understanding of that there is so much that we don't know. And sometimes you simply have to take that on faith. And so he's arguing very strongly that all scientists have a course of humanities where they look at literature, art, music, philosophy, so that they don't lose that sense of wonder that allows them to accept that there's a certain level of irrationality in religion because it isn't there. You can't define it by mathematical equations.
Nice. Go ahead, Joe. Go ahead.
We all need each other. The angels need us. God needs us. We need all of them. And there are, we could talk about this for a long time, but it's very plain that none of us can do something just for himself or herself without understanding that we have a responsibility. We have to play our part in how things work. If not, it's all going to go away. And sometimes we get awful close, like right now, when we're faced with this awful thing that's happening to us. And just reading the newspaper this morning, I was really, I don't have a good clean word for it, but what are we talking about? We have this thing that may destroy all of us, and somebody is saying, well, in a few weeks we'll start going to the movies again. It's not going to happen, and we have to understand this. And this is a really tough time, and this particular discussion today comes to the heart of what our responsibilities are. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I want to bring that together just again, which is to say, I love what Joe said, which is God needs us and we need God, and the concept of humans connecting with each other and the responsibility one to another, that it creates a bigger understanding and a bigger connection, is the whole ball of wax, is what Joe was saying, which is really nice. Rich, did you want to say something? No, Rich didn't want to say something. Go ahead, Phil.
I just want to say that I agree with what everybody's saying, but I'm particularly touched by the idea that even when we are suffering ourselves, that it's important to not lose sight of helping our fellow and helping each other and doing what we can. The idea that even when you're really in intensely down place, that if you make time and space to listen to somebody else complain to you about their terrible time, that you're on another level of goodness. I mean, that to me is really big right now.
Yeah, and I think it's a challenge too. I think internally most of us are like, I had a bad day like 4 or 5 days ago when I was like day 6 of quarantine with my kids, and they were driving me crazy. And I was like, there's going to be like 53 more days of this. I'm losing my mind. This is going to be awful. And also looking ahead at, where the exponential curve was moving was really devastating for me. And the idea that I could say to myself, I have nothing to give the world. I am going to hide under the covers and eat some ice cream and hope this goes away. And to be told by a rabbi who lived in the Warsaw Ghetto, no matter how miserable you feel, you need to reach out to other human beings, that blew me away. That really moved me at a deep level. That like, and I love that. So the PSS and the Rebbe, for those who don't know, when the ghetto was liquidated, he was on one of the early transports in August of 1941, 42. And he went to Auschwitz and then to a labor camp, and he died at one of the labor camps. And his works were dug up by a Polish construction crew in 1950. This is a guy who was talking from a real place of being on the edge of fear and existence and death. And he constantly says in his letters, don't hate people, love them, reach out to human beings, and never despair. Don't give up, which was amazing for me. Marilyn, did you want to say something? Okay. I think it's a good place to end. We're 9 minutes over. It was great to see you all today. We'll be back next week with something interesting. And everybody have a really good, healthy week where we all reach out to each other and do what the PSS and the Rabbi said, which is love each other. And VeKara Zeh El Zeh, call out one to another.
Marilyn.
Yeah.
You think